Hello, and welcome to another episode of Break into Law School. I am really excited because today we're going to be talking about a topic that you might not have been thinking about, or maybe you have been thinking about, but you're afraid to say that you've been thinking about. We are going to talk about the topic of a JD PhD. Like, who wants that? Like, all of that school. Like, you want to go to law school and then more school and then more school and then get a doctorate. Yes. But I know that there are people out there that are interested in a PhD. They're interested in continued studies. They're also interested in getting a JD. They don't really know how it works together. And so I'm so excited that we get to have a conversation with Professor Mark Satta, who was one of my classmates at Harvard Law School. Professor Satta is in the Department of Philosophy at Wayne State University, which is in Michigan. He received his BA in Psychology and Communications from Houghton College. He then received another BA, and he'll talk to you about it, in philosophy from SUNY Brockport. He received his JD from Harvard Law School, which is where I met him, of course. And then he has his PhD in philosophy from Purdue University. I will let him talk more about his journey, about his path, and figuring out and discerning what he was interested in, why he got two terminal degrees, how he's using those degrees, what you might want to think about as you are considering your own JD PhD path, and everything in between. So without further ado, I want to welcome Mark Satta. Professor Satta, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Thanks for being here. I'm really excited about this and really excited about this conversation. I know I gave a very brief overview of you, but I'd love it if you could just start off with telling us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I grew up in Western New York State in Rochester, New York. And I always assumed I would go to college. But when it came time to go to college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And I was also scared that college was expensive. So I thought I might want to be a social worker, which is why I picked the majors that I did. And I did my undergraduate degree in 3 years. And then I started working in the admissions office at Houghton, where I had been an undergrad. During this time, I was really starting to seriously rethink the idea of being a social worker. Like a lot of students, you go in with a certain idea of what might be a good fit for you, and then you realize, oh, it's probably not. So when I was working in this job, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I really liked working on a college campus. I liked working with students. But what I thought I really wanted to do was teach, not stay in a staff position. But when I stopped and reflected on that, I realized I didn't really want to teach communication or psychology, which were the fields I had gotten my degree in. What I really wanted to do was teach something like philosophy. So, what I decided to do was see if there was a way for me to get more undergraduate training that would prepare me to go to grad school in philosophy. Law was another field that I was thinking I might be interested in at the time. So I started hunting around, and what I discovered is some institutions have special tracks for students who want to get a second bachelor's degree. Basically, you transfer in all the credits from your first bachelor's degree, and then you have to take some set number of credits at that second institution and complete a major there. So that's what I did at SUNY Brockport, one of the state of New York schools, which worked out great. Because I was a state resident, the tuition was not, it was more manageable. It's even more manageable now than it was at the time. And I only had to take 30 credits. So I took 30 credits of philosophy as a way to prepare for going to grad school in philosophy. When I looked at grad programs, I was considering both just PhD programs in philosophy. I also discovered there was a handful of really cool looking JD PhD programs. Notable examples are the programs at UCLA and NYU. And I thought, oh, that would be super cool. But I was terrified of committing to that much graduate school. It seemed like so much. Spoiler alert, I ended up doing that much grad school, but it felt scary as a 23-year-old to make that level of commitment. So I decided what I was going to do. I was more interested in the PhD in philosophy than I was in the JD at the time. So I figured I'll start with what I'm most interested in. The other nice thing is it's a lot easier to get funding for a PhD than it is for a JD. So I thought this way, I'm not making that sort of like financial commitment of getting a law degree if I decide that's what I don't really want. So I applied to PhD programs, and we can talk more about that application process later. So I applied based on programs that were strong in the areas of philosophy I was most interested in. I was fortunate enough to get into Purdue, which matched well with my areas of interest. So when I applied to Purdue, I didn't even know what state it was in, but I got in. It was the best fit of the places I get into. And off I moved to Indiana for 5 years, 5 great years, actually. And during that time, if you're getting a PhD in philosophy, you're training to be an academic, you're training to be a professor. But like a lot of academic job markets, the philosophy academic job market is really, really competitive. There just aren't enough full-time positions teaching philosophy for the number of people that are getting PhDs in philosophy. So about halfway through, I was thinking about this and trying to figure out, what do I want to do? Some people kind of stretch out how long they're in their PhD program as a way to try to get more publications, more teaching experience, to become stronger candidates. I picked a different strategy. I decided I was going to try to finish my PhD on the 5-year schedule, but then go to law school and get an extra credential that might help me stand out on a competitive job market. So I studied for the LSAT during my 3rd year as a PhD student, 3rd year out of 5. I was getting the sort of scores that I wanted on my LSAT practice test. So I went ahead, took the LSAT, and then after I got that result, I was like, okay, I'm committed to going to law school. This will save me the big time and headache of applying to academic jobs at the tail end of my PhD, because that's a lot of work, a lot of effort. I was like, instead, I'll put that time towards crafting my law school application, because I figured if I took a break between PhD and JD, I might never make it all the way through. So I was like, we're just going to push through. I'm going to go do the rest of grad school and then think about the job market. So that's what I did. I was fortunate enough to get into Harvard Law. I had a tough time choosing programs, mainly because the choice to go to Harvard was very expensive. I had some less expensive options, but I ultimately chose Harvard because, aside from Yale, it does the best with academic job placement, and that's what I really wanted to do. So I decided to make that investment, take on the debt, because I thought it would help me meet my goals. So off I went, got the JD. My first serious attempt on the academic job market was my last year of law school, and I didn't get anything. It was a bust. But thankfully, I had a law degree, and I was able to go find a job at a firm back in Rochester, where I grew up, which worked out well because that's where my partner was living at the time. I went, started practicing, and I gave the academic job market another shot, and things went much better the second time. And I got the position that I'm in now.
Oh my goodness, what a story. There's so many good themes in that story too. One of those themes being persistence. Also, like, have a plan, have a backup plan, and have a backup plan to your backup plan, right? Like, I love that practicing law was actually the backup plan to like being a professor, and the JD itself was just the backup plan to making sure that you could get a strong professorship. And so that's very cool to see. And I also really think it's important to note that, like, you played the long game. And that's kind of what I tell my students. I say we don't make long-term decisions based off of short-term emotions, right? And so the short-term emotion is, I don't want to be in school for 7, 9, like however many years, 5, 8, right? I don't want to be in school for 8 years.
That's right.
I'm like sitting here doing math.
And for some people, it ends up being more than 8,
Yes.
particularly if you do both degrees. So,
But if I understand it correctly, you didn't really do a combined JD PhD then. You did a PhD, and at the end of your PhD, you got a JD. So
that's right. Yeah.
So your application process was traditional for both the PhD programs, and then separately traditional for the JD program.
Yeah, that's right. There's 3 routes that you can end up being a JD PhD. You can do the JD first, then do the PhD afterwards. You can do the PhD first and the JD afterwards, or you can apply concurrently to both types of programs. If I think about the JD PhDs I know, It's roughly a 50-50 split. I think I actually know slightly more people who have done the JD and PhD at separate institutions than have applied to a joint program. I think that's partly a product of the institutions I've gone to. Neither Purdue nor Harvard has like a particularly clear JD, PhD in philosophy track. If I had gone to NYU or UCLA, for example, my answer might be different. I might know predominantly people who like were part of like a joint program. But yeah, in terms of marketability for academic positions, there's not a huge advantage, I don't think, to doing either a concurrent program where you apply to both at once at the same institution, or getting 2 degrees at 2 different institutions. If anything, the one nice thing about doing 2 different institutions is you get the backing of 2 different institutions. You now have terminal degrees at 2 different places, 2 different sets of faculty. You are part of 2 different alumni networks. So that can be an advantage of doing the programs at separate places. But
I
yeah, by and large, both are great options.
I love that, and I wanted to dig into that a little bit more because students often ask me which one should they do first, and I feel like at least the students that I've seen also are about 50-50 split. Some students want both a JD and a PhD, but ultimately want to practice the law. And some students want a JD and PhD and ultimately want to be a professor. And then there are some students who maybe erroneously, and we can talk about it, think that you must get a JD, PhD to be a law professor, which is not the case. When you're thinking, okay, I want to practice law, is there an order of those degrees that makes sense if you don't get them concurrently? And then same question, if you're thinking, I want to be a professor, I know you said you could kind of do either way, but could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. So if your primary goal is to practice law, that's the thing that you want to do. I think you have to have a very particular reason for wanting to also do the PhD. Because most law jobs, you do not need a PhD in order to do them. Good answers as to why you might do the PhD as well. Maybe it's just something you're really passionate about. If you can get funded to get this terminal degree, learn about something that you really care about, getting a PhD doesn't always have to be like practically career oriented. If it's just a passion that you're lucky enough to be able to like get the time to spend pursuing, that's fine. But in terms of legal practice goals, the circumstances where a PhD is going to be helpful are very limited. I can think of a few examples. I know a guy who got a JD and then a PhD in economics, and he works for the Federal Reserve, and a job where it helped him to really have both that advanced background in economics and that legal background for his particular position. I also know a guy that he went and got a PhD in chemistry, thinking he wanted to work in a very particular kind of patent law. He got the PhD first, then went to law school and decided he actually really did not want to work in that area of patent law. So he's got a job as a lawyer now that I think he could have gotten without getting the PhD. I don't know if he is still glad that he got the PhD or not, but like that's an example of someone who got a degree that I don't think actually advanced their career interests. So for the person who wants to practice law, that's the thing they're most excited about. I would say go get that JD. Start there, do that first. And then if you develop interests or goals that require more education, you can always circle back around. For the person who wants to be an academic, I don't think there's a single right answer as to how to do things. Part of it might be pragmatic in terms of what kinds of programs you're well situated to get into. So let's say, you want to do a PhD in political science, but you actually didn't start taking political science coursework until your senior year of undergrad, and you just don't have that many courses on your transcript. But you also really want to do a JD, and you have a great undergraduate GPA, and you got an excellent LSAT score. There, maybe you go do the JD first because you're in a good position to get into a good JD program, and you're not as in good a position to get into a political science program. But the reverse could happen. Maybe you were a stellar undergraduate in political science, you've got people who are willing to write you excellent letters of recommendation. Your grades are great, but your LSAT score wasn't very good. Or at least it wasn't the sort of score you were hoping for the sort of schools you were hoping to get into, particularly given that law school is such a big financial commitment. Maybe that's a good reason to start in a PhD program in political science. And then you could always try retaking the LSAT later or applying to law schools at some later point. The one other thing worth noting is just because you start one program first doesn't mean you'll necessarily finish that one first. That's particularly true of the PhD. It's pretty common for JD PhDs to do the following. They start a PhD. They do the first 2, maybe 3 years, which are often called the coursework phase. If you think about PhDs as coming in roughly 2 parts, you do graduate coursework, you write a dissertation. Sometimes people do that first part first, the coursework, the PhD coursework. Then they take a break in the middle. They go do the JD. Sometimes they even work a legal job for a while, like a clerkship or at a firm for a couple of years after doing the JD. And then they come back and they finish the PhD and they write the dissertation. Why might someone do that, you ask? Excellent question, I'll tell you. It's because the PhD is, if the PhD is funded, often how much funding you have is a little bit flexible. So if someone finishes by doing the dissertation last, they might be able to go on the job market a few times. And if they don't succeed, fall back by doing another year of PhD coursework. The JD doesn't work that way. You don't want to drag it out. That would be a painful and expensive choice. So you could always start with the PhD. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to finish it before you do the JD. Did I get all the things?
You touched on so many things. I have more follow-up questions, of course. You mentioned 2 different scenarios of undergraduate students who might want to start with either the JD or the PhD. But what about the undergraduate student who did not do as well, who maybe doesn't have a stellar GPA? Is there a path that makes the most sense to maximize kind of what their academic background is?
Yeah, I think there's a few paths that make sense in that position. One would be to go work in a relevant job that's going to sort of like add to their story and to their experience. That I think is particularly true for the person who might want to do the JD first. And also it sort of maybe depends on the discipline where you want to get the PhD. You can go get some work experience, some life experience, maybe position yourself to get a really strong letter of recommendation from an employer. During that time, maybe you're also studying for the LSAT. So, even if your undergraduate GPA isn't stellar, maybe you can get a higher LSAT score than you were positioned to get when you were finishing undergrad, something like that. So there are other ways that you can sort of like build up your I don't really love this phrase, but sort of like build up your profile, so to speak. The other route someone can take is trying to get a master's degree in the field that they think they might want to get a PhD in. Unlike PhD programs, master's degrees, it's not standard that they'll be funded. Sometimes you can find a funded master's, but not always. So I'll put it this way. If you are admitted to a PhD program, but they're not going to fund you, that's a reason to sort of like step back and examine that program. You might consider that sort of like a red flag. If a master's program isn't going to fund you, that's not a red flag. It's of course great if they will, but it's more standard. So for the person who manages to get into a master's program, that can be a second chance to sort of like rebuild your profile, so to speak. I think it's only worth doing the master's if you think your life circumstances are such that it will actually like strengthen your marketability for the PhD or the JD. If you feel like your undergraduate grades weren't good enough for you to get into a JD program or a PhD program, getting a master's degree with the same sort of grades isn't going to be that helpful. So if the reason why you felt like you struggled in undergrad was because you were working too many hours, at your jobs and you weren't able to devote enough time to studying, I'd say maybe try to like learn from that experience and try to do the master's with some sort of variable changed where you're able to carve out more time for studying. Or maybe you do it part-time and you take it one class at a time. You think I can knock one class out of the park each semester if I like break it up and I do it slowly or something like that. So yeah, just because undergrad maybe didn't go the way you were hoping, or like you feel like the grades just aren't strong enough, that's not the end of the game. There are lots of other things you can do. But I think it makes a lot of sense to be really intentional and sort of make a plan about what you're going to do. Because what I don't want to see people doing is spending money on a master's degree and then going and get the master's degree and then feeling like they're still not well prepared to meet the goals that the master's degree was supposed to help set them up for.
And it sounds like from your earlier comments, also, if you feel like your undergraduate GPA is not that great and you're thinking about getting a master's to help with that for perhaps a PhD program, you would want to make sure that you actually need said PhD program. Like if you're a student that's like, well, I really just want to practice law, just go to law school. Because at that point, the many different trips down the PhD path to ultimately still practice law is probably not a good use of funds and time.
That's right. Yeah. If someone doesn't have a particular reason, like an important career-oriented reason why they want or need the PhD, a master's first normally isn't going to be super helpful for someone for law school. I mean, now we're sort of stepping more into your area of expertise over mine. It seems like there could be certain master's degrees that would be helpful. I'm thinking like if someone wants to do like health law, if they get like a master's of public health, something like that. But those are like very specific circumstances. Yeah, in general, it doesn't make sense to get a master's in a field where the normal terminal degree is a PhD if you don't need that PhD and what you really want to do is go practice law. Yeah.
Absolutely. That makes sense. And then kind of, I wanted to piggyback on an earlier question. In terms of timing, if you're a student who knows you want to practice law, does it matter if the JD happens last? Like, because I know, and I did not get a PhD, so I only know our experience at law school, but the hiring process gets started right after 1L, right? You're on this path and this track, and I'm trying to imagine someone who really wants to practice law not being on that hiring path because they're going to leave the JD to get a 5-year PhD and then trying to re-enter as a first-year associate somewhere. So does that matter at all?
I think it does. So, right, if your goal is to practice and you want a PhD, either go ahead and get that PhD first so that you're like ready to go practice right after law school and do the JD second. Or, so here's the thing. There's like no expiration on when you're a viable PhD applicant. If you've got a passion for history, but you want to practice law, you can get the JD anytime and you can start practicing. You could practice for 20 years before you apply to a PhD program in history or take any graduate coursework in history. There's like no rush. So yeah, I think in general, if your goal is to practice law, sort of like the worst place to place the PhD would be directly after getting your JD without getting any legal job experience first. That just doesn't really make sense if the goal is to practice.
Absolutely. I think I definitely agree with that. There's something about, practicing law, taking a break and coming back to law that people sort of understand, but I think there is some hesitancy because we all know that law school doesn't actually really teach you how to be a lawyer. There is definitely some hesitancy in taking someone with no practice experience and also kind of a break from the legal field.
That's right. Yeah. I'm not saying it can't be done, but there would have to be some sort of like very compelling reason to do it. Yeah. I think it does put one at a disadvantage for getting legal jobs.
Right. And you never want to go through 8 years of school and then be at a disadvantage.
Right. Yes.
You need most advantaged is what you want after 8 years of school. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like you said at the start, I was like playing a long game. And it was about patience. It was about delayed gratification. In my case, it was totally worth it because I got the things that I wanted, but it wouldn't have been worth it if I had in fact sort of like self-sabotaged by spending so much time. Um,
Absolutely. Let's talk about that notion of being most advantaged and not self sabotaging yourself. When we talk about finances, we have talked a lot about the fact that a lot of PhD programs are fully funded. If you know anything a little bit about the JD, PhD, the joint programs, or even getting the JD, whether it's from the same or a different institution, are there ways in which you can kind of make this more financially advantageous for you?
I think at least in a small handful of situations, yes. Sometimes by being, and this is going to be particularly true if you get the JD PhD at the same institution in the following sorts of ways. So if the institution has some sort of like concurrent dual degree program, like they've got a specific program for the JD PhD in the field that you want, often they like shave a little bit of time off of both of the programs, so it can be a bit accelerated. So while it takes more time to do the JD PhD than it would to do either degree separately, it might be faster to do institution X's dual degree in a JD PhD than it would be at two separate places. So that can help a little bit. So let's say you're funded for all the semesters where you're considered a PhD student, not the ones where you're considered a JD student. If there are less than 6 semesters when you're considered a JD student, you will save some money compared to people that spend a full 3 years in law school. So that can be one way that you can save a little money. The other way is sometimes institutions will cover the law school costs for JD PhD students. So I think Harvard, it's like a separate program you apply to, but there are a few students every year who are in the law school who are also PhD students at Harvard, and they're not paying for law school because they're sort of like their funding extends to their time as a law student. So if you can find something like that, that's very cool. I was pretty jealous that it existed. And I was like, well, I also have a PhD and it's not helping me save any money, but that's fine. So there are ways that it can be financially beneficial.
And I want to talk about the maybe nuances of some of those applications and considerations, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't skip over the SJD. Because most people don't know about the SJD. They, people watching are probably like, what is that letter? I don't know those letters.
Yeah.
And, I hinted at it earlier. There's the fact that you also do not need any other degree besides a JD to be a law professor. So can you kind of parse out for me, if you know, and I don't want to presume you know a lot about the SJD, how that differs from a JD, PhD, and why you would need either of these things if you want to be a law professor?
Right. Yes. So I'm gonna sort of like back up for a minute in a way that will ultimately get to answer your question in a way that I hope will be helpful. So, right, if someone's goal is to be an academic, how to position yourself well depends on what kind of department or school you want to work in. Preparing to be an academic in a law school is different than preparing to be an academic in history or philosophy or economics or sociology or something like that. Most disciplines require you to have a PhD most of the time in order to be a faculty member. So I'm actually going to start about talking about disciplines that aren't law, and then I'll talk about the weird way that the law works afterwards. So if you're thinking, gee, I'd like to be a professor in, philosophy, political science, etc. At most institutions, there's going to be 3 kinds of jobs, roughly speaking. There's going to be adjuncts. Adjuncts are paid per course by a university. And those positions typically don't come with things like long-term contracts or health benefits or something like that. So that's one sort of position one can have in these departments. You can be some sort of permanent but non-tenured lecturer. Those are people that have, maybe multi-year contracts in an institution. They probably have benefits like health insurance, and they're salaried, but they don't have tenure. They don't have that sort of like long-term commitment from the institution as sort of like a permanent hire. And then there are people who are on the tenure track and tenured, where the idea is the university will eventually give them tenure, sort of sees them as sort of like long-term permanent faculty, which isn't to say that non-tenured lecturers aren't also long-term permanent faculty, but there's not that same sort of guarantee. So when you're thinking about working in a history department or something like that, often the thing people are striving for is a tenure track position. In order to get that, you're going to need a PhD in the relevant fields, often a fair amount of publications, relevant work experience, things like that. So how does a JD fit into wanting to be faculty in a history department or philosophy department or something like that? Well, if you have the JD in addition to the PhD, you might stand out on the job market. You're going to have a special sort of insight into, legal history or philosophy of law or something like that not everyone else in the job market's going to have. So it can give you a leg up in terms of looking like an appealing candidate. Also, if the field you want to work in is one where it's common for the students to go to law school, so fields like political science, philosophy, economics, history, a lot of those students are interested in going to law school. So one of the things I love about my job is a lot of the students who are philosophy majors and minors are thinking about law school. It's one of the career options they're considering. So I'm able to talk with students from a position of experience where I can say, this is what law school was like, this is what practicing was like, this is what taking the bar was like, here are the pros and cons, how to sort of like figure out where to apply, things like that. So I think another advantage being someone with a JD in these academic departments is sort of like the ability to advise students and think about their career aspirations. So that's the non-law school side of things, where PhDs are a standard requirement for being a faculty member. As you've rightly pointed out, that's not how law schools work. Law schools are different. In the United States, the JD is considered a terminal degree, meaning sort of like the end of the line in terms of like advanced degrees. In most fields, the PhD is the terminal degree. But in the US, that's the JD, which means lots of law professors don't have another graduate degree aside from the JD. So if you want to teach in a law school, a PhD is definitely not a prerequisite. I'll back up for a second. Just like I said, there are different types of jobs in places like philosophy departments. There's a similar sort of taxonomy in law schools. And law schools, it's a bit more complicated even. There are adjunct faculty members in law schools, just like there are in other departments. And often those adjuncts are people who sort of like do something cool and specific that maybe no one on a law school faculty would have extensive experience with. So, if you work in some sort of like obscure area of art law, there may be no better person in your city to teach the art law class at the local law school than you. And the law school would love to have you teach about your specific area of expertise that's not represented on the faculty. But generally, sometimes I talk to people who are like, oh, it'd be so fun to be able to like teach a law school class. They want to go practice law, but they like the idea of someday teaching a class. You do not need the PhD for that by any means. Go do your cool thing. And then at some point, see if you can establish a relationship with a law school. So that's what the adjunct world looks like in law schools. Then there are clinical professors, the professors who run the legal clinics where they're working with students, helping them get sort of practical legal experience. Those people very rarely have PhDs. What they have is expertise in whatever the clinical field is. So if it's health law or food law or sports law or election law or something like that, the reason they're clinical faculty is because they're great at that kind of law. They've got experience, expertise, and they can help mentor students. So you certainly don't need a PhD for that. You just need a law degree, pass the bar, get the relevant legal experiences. Depending on the institution, these jobs might still be very competitive, but getting a PhD is not going to give you a leg up probably for those sorts of jobs. It's going to be your work experience and your ability to mentor students, things like that. Then in law schools, there are also I'm skipping other jobs like often people who teach things like legal research and writing, they're sort of in their own category. But just for the sake of time, the other kind of like big track is the tenure track and tenured faculty. These are the people that teach a lot of the black letter law classes, upper level seminars, publish in law reviews, things like that. So this is often sort of the paradigm that people have in mind when they say, I want to be a law professor. Lots of these people do not have PhDs. The legal field is prestige driven, however, though. So if you're thinking about trying to be a law professor, it's like you need to tick one or more of the following boxes. Go to a fairly highly ranked law school, get one or more clerkships, publish in law reviews, have a PhD in a related field. I said check one or more of those boxes, not all those boxes. You do not need to check all of those boxes in order to be a law professor. But most people end up checking at least one of those boxes, if not more. So it sort of depends on your own story and circumstances, what route might be the best route to try to be a law professor. So in my case, I didn't do a clerkship, and I still could have been a viable candidate for a law school position, but I probably would have been someone who did like legal philosophy, the person that sort of teaches specialized courses in that sort of topic, that sort of domain. And in my case, having the PhD would have been sort of like an offsetting benefit for the fact that I like didn't have a clerkship. But also, if I didn't have a PhD and I wanted to teach in a law school, I probably would have applied for clerkships and tried to do that as part of my story. So there's like multiple ways to try to turn yourself into a strong law school faculty candidate. It's a competitive market, but the PhD is certainly not a requirement. I think in general, when it's a good fit is if the areas of law that you're interested in teaching in would sort of like benefit from an adjacent PhD. So if you're really interested in law and economics, having an economics PhD could be a great way to get hired in some sort of faculty position in law school where you'll be teaching courses in law and economics. Legal history is a really common example of where people have both the PhD and the JD, even in law schools, but it's not required. But okay, having said all that, what is this mysterious SJD? So the SJD is sort of the PhD equivalent from a law school. Like you do what people are doing in PhD programs, but in a law school, meaning that you'll spend a couple extra years doing coursework and then you'll write a dissertation. But if it's not necessary to practice, to be a professor in a US law school, why would you do it? Well, the answer is most people who get the SJD are actually trying to be competitive in a foreign job market. A lot of SJDs, they'll come from a foreign country. Maybe they have a law degree from that country. And then basically they're doing their graduate school abroad because certain countries don't treat the law degrees as the same sort of terminal degrees for going into law faculty positions. It's more standard to do a PhD like training. And because the US has a lot of great law schools, many of them with SJD programs, people will come over and do the SJDs here. I don't want to say it's never the case that an SJD would be a good idea for someone who wants to be law faculty in the US. So let's say you went to a law school that doesn't place many people in academic jobs. But you went to law school, you were successful, you've been practicing, and now what you're thinking is, what I really, really want to do is teach. That's what I want to do for the next part of my career. Trying to get an SJD at a place that has good academic job placement might be the route by which you make your transition. It might be how you pivot. Because then when you go on the job market, you can not only say, yes, I've got my law degree from here, I've got this relevant legal experience, but I also wrote this great dissertation in this SJD program, and now it's been turned into law review articles. And when I was talking about the box that you check, you want to check that I've published law review articles box. That's really helpful for trying to get a faculty position. People often don't do a full SJD in order to make that pivot. An LLM is a more common way to make that pivot. Because it's short, and you might not want to make a 5-year pivot if you could make a 1-year pivot instead. The difference is like PhDs, SJDs are probably more likely to be funded. LLM programs, it's very hard to get funding for those.
That was amazing. I took many
8
notes.
years of grad school experience plus some relevant work experience up there.
It's
Yeah.
like you knew I was going to ask you about the LLM. It's like you knew, you sensed that was my next question, and you were like, I'm answering it. Hold on a second.
Just being proactive here.
I do know that there are some schools like Harvard that only accept their own LLM students into their SJD, which is, it is a choice. But that's just something to be mindful of as well. If you're like, oh, I'm gonna get this SJD at Harvard, like probably not. Just
Yeah. Just being realistic. Yes, that's a really good point. Yeah, the other thing is you could always, if you think what you want to do is make the career transition to being an academic, maybe you invest in that 1 year LLM. You get some mentors, hopefully out of that experience, and you can kind of talk with them from there about what your most sensible next step is. Is it trying to then go clerk? Is it trying to find a visiting assistant professorship where you spend a couple years at a law school getting some teaching experience and trying to write a law review article, something like that? The SJD might be like one possibility among several that are discussed to like help you make the transition.
absolutely. So if I'm a student, I'm sitting here, I'm listening. I've been listening. I'm still like, I think I want to get a JD and a PhD, and I'm trying to figure out my life. The first thing, as we've kind of discussed, is to figure out what is the career advantage. Well, probably actually step one is to figure out if you're really, really interested in practicing or you're really, really interested in teaching. Now, I understand that there may be some students who are like, both. Okay. But
Yeah.
maybe which one do you want to do first? I always tell students you can do a lot of things with a law degree. You cannot do them all at the same time. And this is one of those things. You must do one first.
Yeah.
You can sort of do both, but for the purposes of our exercise and probably your sanity in this application process, choose one to focus on. And that might help you determine if you want to do the JD and then the PhD and then the JD, or if you're looking at jointly funded programs, also looking at your own academic background, the strength of your undergraduate courses. Do you want to get a PhD in something that you even have your undergraduate degree in? Your LSAT score, your financial situation, looking at what's going to be a better funding situation, and those sort of considerations. Are there any other considerations that students need to be thinking about in terms of, am I a good candidate for this? Is this a good path for me? Should I even really be pursuing both of these? Any other things that maybe they're looking for in PhD programs, or of course the JD, that would make a student a better fit for one or other?
Yeah. So first, maybe just a bit of a side note. It's okay if you like have plan A and you change your mind. So let's say we've got someone who's thinking, my ultimate goal is to be a professor, but I'm in a better position to like go get a JD first. So I'm going to go do that, set myself up really well for the PhD. If you fall in love with the area of law that you're working in and you decide you want to practice it until you retire, great. You've saved yourself a big headache of going and doing a PhD. You've found work that you're happy and satisfied with. Like, it's okay to change your mind. Similarly, someone may start the PhD because they are nervous about making that big financial commitment of law school, but they tell themselves, I'm always going to come back around. But maybe they sort of like fall out of love with the idea of getting a law degree. That's fine. You're not stuck doing it. Like, all this is very malleable. I think it might depend on the institution, but even if you're someone who gets a joint degree, like applies to a joint program, don't consider yourself like you have not covenanted to the institution that you must get both degrees. Like there's flexibility, and one of the nice things about doing grad school is you gain relevant experience, limited experience, particularly in the case of law school, as to like what the career outcomes look like, and you might sort of like change your views as you go. So I think the like JD PhD path, you both want to have that like grit and patience to like do the long haul. while also staying flexible enough that you can sort of like change your mind as you go, if it makes sense to. But yeah, thinking about sort of like the relevant things to consider, you kind of like when you were talking, Sydney, you kind of hit on my most of my list of the things that matter. Thinking about your financial position, thinking about sort of like opportunity costs in terms of time, thinking about where you're well positioned to succeed, get into the sorts of institutions you want, thinking about what you're most passionate about right this moment, what you're most confident you really want to do, thinking about how the ordering of the degrees lines up with your goals and ambitions, other things over and above
Or
that.
even
So,
whatever PhDs are looking for, like as you as a student, do you need any kind of characteristics to be successful?
okay. Thank you. Yeah, so it's somewhat field dependent, but I think a lot of the things that are going to come up for most PhDs, you want to be someone who is dependable and reliable. So that means, if you're someone who's TA'd for a course, or if you have the chance to TA for a course in undergrad, it's worth being really on top of things, showing that you're sort of like grounded, dependable, reliable. As far as being a student in class, being someone who's engaged, enthusiastic, shows that they really care about the subject matter. These things are going to matter. So I'm thinking about my perspective when I write letters of recommendations. What are the sorts of features want that I find myself wanting to sort of like front and center, that I want people at admissions committees to know? Of course, I'm going to talk about someone's academic abilities, their writing skills, their critical thinking skills, their ability to sort of like engage with tough texts and ask insightful questions. But I also usually end up talking about sort of like how someone contributes to the dynamics of class. There's someone who sort of like recognizes, acknowledges, respects the comments made by others. Students who say things like, I really appreciated what student X had to say. Here's something else I was thinking. Like, I often take note of this as someone who's like capable of working collaboratively, like praising others, and sort of like building and contributing to a class dynamic. I think those things can be so sorry, I guess I'm kind of like my brain moved into sort of like two different categories, and I'm going to separate them out. I think this might be a little better. There's what things can you do and sort of like what characteristics can you display to the people who might write your letters and recommend you. There's like, how do you prepare yourself in that way? And then there's thinking more generally about like what sort of characteristics is it going to be helpful for someone to have to sort of like succeed on the path of either a PhD or JD? And so I was kind of talking back and forth between the two, but let me just separate them a bit more concretely. So starting first of all, thinking about like, what can you do so that people who are going to write your letters are going to be enthusiastic and confident in writing those letters? Take the work seriously. Try as best you can to do things on time, to be organized, be reliable. That doesn't mean that you should be scared of asking for extensions when life throws you curveballs. Like, that's totally fine. But try to be someone who like exhibits that you're like on top of things. And actually, one of the ways you can exhibit that you're on top of things is when you need more time, ask for it. Communicate with your professors. Like when I'm sitting down to write a letter, I'm not going to look back and be like, well, they asked over the 2 courses they took with me, they asked for extensions 3 different times. Like, no, I don't even remember that. I will remember if a student was reliable about communicating their needs, what was going on in their life, asking for extensions in advance when possible, versus that student that I had to email them, be like, hey, just checking in. Like, you sort of went AWOL for a few weeks. Like, even that's something you can recover from, but it's going to take communication, showing that you like recognize my perspective and are kind of like taking ownership and responsibility for your own education. So there are things like that. When I was talking about classroom dynamics, not everyone wants to talk in class. So I certainly don't think like being chatty in class is like a prerequisite for getting a strong letter of recommendation. It's absolutely not. Like, I think about some of my students who are stronger writers, but who don't like talking much in class. There, I'm going to lean really heavily on how they write and what they say to me in their written communication. For students who do like to talk more in class, I'm going to think about not only the quality of their comments, but how they engage with others in the classroom. So all those things are things that are important and matter. Now, stepping away from sort of like how you present yourself to potential letter writers, just thinking about your own headspace. Grad school is an exercise in delayed gratification, whether it's the JD or the PhD. You are putting in the work in hopes that you get things that you want later, which doesn't mean that grad school needs to be unpleasant. I really enjoyed my grad school years, or I enjoyed lots of things about my grad school years. At both institutions, I got to be part of really exciting, vibrant communities. Many of my closest friends are people that I met during my years as a grad student. I learned so much from them and had so much fun. I got a lot of great mentors. So I don't want to say, like, oh, yeah, grad school is just some terrible thing that you need to get through. In fact, I think that's absolutely the wrong mindset about grad school. It can be a thrilling privilege, really, to get to be part of these academic communities and learn and study and converse and all of these things. But often investing financially, at the very least, even when you are in a funded program, like you're not making that much, and there's sort of like opportunity costs. I had my first salaried position at 21, but then I stepped away from that, went to grad school, and didn't have another salaried position until I was 31. So like, that was a number of years that I like wasn't investing in a retirement account or like all these responsible things that people like to do. It was totally worth it. I'm glad I did it. But I think it would have been hard if I didn't have that sort of like long-term planning commitment mindset. The other thing I'd say is it can be really helpful if you have a sense of like self-direction and self-motivation. A lot of grad school can be pretty unsupervised. Like if you're not doing the work, there's not going to necessarily be anyone to notice or who will catch it for a long period of time, which requires some sort of like internal motivation, internal structure, internal grounding, that it has to come from you. You have to be the one that chooses to stay on target, that chooses to put in the work, that comes up with a sort of like schedule, timeline, whatever you need to sort of like get the work done that will make grad school a good path for your ultimate career goals. And that can be hard. I think it comes more easily to some people than others to sort of like self-structure in this sort of way. I actually loved it. Particularly the dissertation stage of the PhD program. It's like, what? I get to decide how I spend every day? That's awesome. Other people find it terrifying. Both sorts of people can succeed in law school, but they need different sorts of plans for succeeding. And I think that's often a cost or like a challenge that people don't think about going in. It's easy to end up sort of like floating, coasting, checking out, whatever, because there aren't those immediate consequences. Like nothing bad's going to happen to you if you skip class today / this week, maybe a couple of weeks, but like it will eventually. So it requires kind of that continual self-motivation, self-organization that, once again, I don't want to be like too much of a prude about it. I'm not saying you have to be on your A game at all times. I mean, that's just not how humans work. Nor was I. And it worked out fine for both of us. Yeah. So I'm not saying like, don't have bad days. Like, of course you're going to have bad days. And I think, I think about classes that I skipped where I was better off in the long run because I skipped that particular day, because I was in touch with myself enough to know I needed the break or the chance to catch up or sleep or whatever. But yeah, it does require making lots of choices on your own. And that can be daunting.
Absolutely. I have just a couple more questions as we kind of get towards the end here. First off, this has been like truly such a gem. I'm so thrilled. What I wanted to know, and I'm gonna bias the answer of it because you and I were both in parody, which is my favorite thing at Harvard Law School, but I will still ask you, what were your favorite and least favorite moments of doing, your PhD and JD journey?
Yeah. So I guess I'll talk in order. I'll start with PhD since I did that first. The things that stick out as sort of favorites. For me, the dissertation writing stage of the PhD was my favorite part because I just had a whole ton of time to read and write. So often in my like academic life, it feels like you're trying to carve out the time to do that research and writing. It's alongside a million other things. You've got to answer the emails, you've got to grade the essays, you have to prep the courses, do all sorts of other stuff, go to the meetings. So the way in which the dissertation stage is often designed as a time where you've got some more space. Clear out your life, never completely. There are still emails and life is going on and work is going on. Um, but that chance to just like chart my own course in terms of what did I want to read? What did I want to write about? That was really fun. I loved that. So that was a really nice thing about doing the PhD. The PhD was where I had a chance to have confirmed my hope that I would be a pretty decent teacher. It was where I was first teaching college courses. And there, it's a bit more of a guided experience because as a grad student teaching courses, there were faculty members in the department that, anytime I was going to teach a new course, I'd email and I'd say, would you be willing to send me your syllabus? Can we talk about how you structure your class? So I was getting that sort of like mentoring. So that was another great part of the PhD process. And man, the third part was just getting to know so many cool graduate students. Not only did I make a lot of really good friends studying philosophy, Purdue has like 10,000 grad students. In my friend circle, I had psychologists and agronomists and electrical engineers and linguists. And I just learned so much from these people, and it created a really rich, fun living experience. I think doing a PhD certainly comes with challenges. Because academic job markets are so competitive, there's risk involved. You can go spend all this time getting this degree, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get a job that you're happy about. I wish that weren't the reality, but it is. And that can hang like a dark cloud over the experience if you let it. So I think, it was discouraging to just, check out the numbers. What does job placement look like this year? How many jobs were there? Oh, there was way fewer jobs than graduates again this year. Ugh. I mean, that was discouraging. Part of how I responded to it was committing to the JD. I tried to come up with a plan in response to it, but that was hard and frustrating. Also, I think there's that sense related to just how competitive the job market is, where I did sometimes feel like I did have to be on all the time. Like I never wanted to make a stupid comment in class, but I wanted to make sure I talked enough. And I wanted to go to all the department colloquia and be sort of like the model student, just recognizing the job's tough. And that could be draining. No one was ever unkind to me, nor did anyone ever say to me, that's what you have to be. It was sort of a pressure I put on myself. But I think it's not an uncommon sort of pressure for PhD students to put on themselves. So, that can be draining too. And also just that sort of like delayed gratification, living off a very small budget. When you're watching other people in their 20s make different choices that allow them to spend a bit more luxuriously, or at least comparatively, there's a cost there. So those are some of the downsides. But on balance, I was really happy as a PhD student. Going into law school, sorry, I guess since I'm talking about downsides, I'll reverse it. I'll start with downsides, and then I'll talk about some of the nice stuff. I think the big downside there was because it was so expensive, it felt like I had to make it worth it in a way that, while in moderation, I think can be really empowering. Sometimes I let it get to be too much. I felt like there was no way that I could possibly do well enough or make enough out of my time to sort of justify this exorbitant cost. And that was like a weight on my shoulders. Different people have different learning styles, and the way the law is taught in many law schools does not cater well to my learning style. I would rather read fewer pages and read them slowly and carefully. I would prefer to enter the discussion at the moments when I feel like I have something valuable to contribute, and otherwise just step back and listen. I'm an auditory learner who wants to just be fed the information by people talking at me. none of that is how law school works. I often felt like I was making trade-offs between not reading everything or reading it so quickly that I wasn't getting all I wanted out of the reading. Law school is supposed to help turn you into a good critical thinker. I already felt like I was a pretty decent critical thinker coming in. What I wanted was to not be told, well, this was how this law used to work. Then it changed this way. Then it changed this way. Then it changed this way. Week 10, congratulations, you've now learned what the law is like in this relevant field. I'm like, that's terrible for how my brain works. So I think there was a way in which I was often frustrated with legal pedagogy because it doesn't work well for me. Or at least it doesn't work. It's not the best way to work for me. But no program can possibly be structured such that it's the best way for everybody to learn, because we learn differently. So I'm not so much trying to knock legal pedagogy as just recognize that it wasn't particularly well suited to my own learning style. So those were some of the hardships. I think on the upside, I did learn a lot of cool things about the law. Part of why I went to law school was because understanding the law is empowering, just for how society works. So many of our social systems are deeply caught up in legal systems. I feel like I have a better handle on how I think about what's just and unjust in our country, how to sort of structure my own life decisions, how I want to be involved in my community, how I want to engage in civic participation. All that is bolstered by what I learned during law school. Of course, also, I've been able to integrate a lot of that into my work as a philosopher. I do a lot of writing and research on things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And that's an area where having background in philosophy and background in law together is so helpful. So I'm really glad that I got both degrees. Also, just as in grad school at Purdue, I got to be part of a great community and meet lots of really cool people. So too, I got to be part of another great community and meet a lot of really cool people at law school. And it really is such a privilege to have been able to meet so many inspirational people across the context of these two institutional settings. I just have people who know a lot of cool things, are working in cool jobs, doing neat stuff, are great people. And I love that. And I think I probably did too many extracurriculars in law school. Part of it is you kind of don't know which ones you want to do until you've started. But yeah, the two that stick out as my favorites are being in Harvard Law School's parody show, because there I got to see people's creative sides, people who could sing and dance and act and write funny jokes. And it was just so great to be part of a very, very different creative endeavor. Part of what brings people together is sort of shared passions, shared activity. And it was just great to collaborate on something artistic rather than something purely academic. So that was really, really great. The other extracurricular I'm really, really glad I did was being part of Harvard's Board of Student Advisors, because that group both mentors first-year law students and works with them in their first-year legal research and writing courses, which was great for me as someone who really cares about education and getting involved with students. It let me sort of both contribute to the community of my law school and also gain more experience as a teacher. So those were some of the good things.
I love it. I love that. And I think I forgot that you were a BSA, but I do really love that organization. I love any organization where you can give back. I wasn't a member of the BSA, but there's some of the best people for sure. Are there any last pieces or last words of advice you can give to anyone? We've covered so much. I'm so grateful for your time and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. But are there any last pieces of advice that you want to give anyone who's pursuing or considering pursuing a JD PhD, or one or the other or both?
Yeah. I think one piece of advice is this is sort of meta advice. Get advice from lots of people. And that's good for at least two reasons. One is sometimes you'll start finding patterns. Everyone might say X, or a bunch of people might say X. And you might be like, wow, okay, now this really sticks out. I've got this sort of confirmation. that lots of people say it's really important to do X, whatever that turned out to be. But also sometimes it's because different people, even if they're really well positioned to give you good advice, everyone's going to be speaking from what worked for them, from their own experiences, their own backgrounds, things like that. And sometimes you may get conflicting advice about certain things, and it will cause you to sort of like take the pros and cons of the advice in different directions. And you may think, gee, as much as I respect Professor X, I don't think this particular piece of advice is the right way for me to go. I'm going to go with what Professor Y said, or what this academic counselor said, or something like that. So I think you want to get kind of like a rich, deep network, if you can, of people who are willing to sort of like share their thoughts and input. It's also, I think sometimes we can feel nervous about asking of people. We don't want to waste anyone's time. We don't want to be a burden. We feel like others are busy. All these things are true. But if you're thinking about getting a JD or a PhD, that means you've already been or will be a college student somewhere. And the people at colleges and universities generally really want to support their students. They want to give advice. They want to root for you and be on your team. And we don't know to do that unless you let us know what you want to do. I am excited when I can write letters of recommendations for my students for law school or grad programs. And often I'm best positioned to do that well if they let me know their interest early on, and we have, multiple conversations over whatever period of time I'm working with them. And when they ask me for advice, I'll give them advice, and I'll also say, but talk to other people too. Don't just rely on one person's advice. Try to get like a network of people who can help you. Some of you may have that not only from your undergraduate institution, but other places in your life. Some of you, particularly first-year college students, may not have much of a network outside of the institution where you're getting your degree. And that's totally okay. Then really lean into that network and try to get as much advice as you can. Generally, people are going to want you to succeed and will be happy to give good faith advice when you ask questions. So yeah, I've been long-winded, so I'll leave it at that.
No, I love it. Where can people find you if they want to hear your musings, get more Professor Satta? Where are you on the interweb?
Yeah, so I do. It seems so silly, but so many academics, I have my own webpage. It's just my name, marksatta.com, or you can get there by marksatta.wordpress.com. That has info on the things that I'm working on, the things that I'm publishing, the things that I'm teaching. You also, if you just Google like Wayne State philosophy faculty, I'll pop up along with my cool colleagues, and you can see what we're up to. Yeah, I'm happy to ask. I'm happy to answer people's questions, particularly for people who are interested in JD PhDs in philosophy. For that niche, that's where I'm like best positioned to like give sort of like insider information, I guess. Also for people who might be considering graduate school in philosophy, particularly if they're interested in the sort of things that I work in, like free speech, freedom of religion, issues in epistemology, like evidence law, things like that. I'm happy to talk with people.
Absolutely. Well, we'll make sure that we've linked both of those in the description and the show notes. But Mark, thank you so much for just being here with us. Like I said, sharing your wisdom, helping shed some light on what is often a really confusing and not often talked about process or career choice. So I really appreciate that. For everyone that is listening, if you liked this video or you liked this podcast episode, make sure you rate and review, like and subscribe, share it with a friend. Do you have someone who is thinking about embarking on an 8-year academic journey? This is the video for them. Make sure that you come back and see the different videos, and let us know in the comments if you liked this, if you have questions for Professor Satta. We are here for you.